Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition, we're joined by three distinguished educators as we continue our discussion on strategies to develop excellence in our children. To my left, we have Brother Basir Mchawi. And next to him, we're joined by Sister Barbara Glover. And last but certainly not least, Professor James Blake. And in our first half, we heard our distinguished panel talk about some of the things that we need to keep aware of and some of the strategies. But now I just want to ask a few questions. And I'm going to start with Brother Basir. Basir, in terms of as someone coming up, what were some of the things that helped you to develop to the person we know you today?
Well, the first thing is I was fortunate to have a mother and grandmother. I was raised by my mother and grandmother who, number one, first embraced literacy in all its forms. My grandmother actually taught folks her age how to read. So when I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, I would observe my grandmother teaching folks her age how to read. By the time I was about 6 or 7, my grandmother gave me a Webster's Unabridged Dictionary, which I still have in my office. This is one of these things, it's about this thick. In those days, the dictionary was not only the dictionary, it was also an atlas and an encyclopedia. Okay, I have it with the inscription that my grandmother wrote then. My mother, she was one who was into the culture. She was into the culture of bebop and music. So I grew up early on. I could hum tunes by Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. I remember the first concert that my mother took me to, seeing Count Basie and Ahmad Jamal when I was probably about 9 or 10 years old. So I was blessed.
Yes.
And in terms of that particular blessing, I have to say the other thing, I guess, that gave me a lot of self-determination is that I'm a project boy. I grew up in Throgs Neck Projects in the Bronx. So projects have a particular culture all of their own. And, you learn very, very early on how to survive and do various and sundry kinds of things. So my mother and grandmother put me on the road, and I was just exposed to things very early, and that just opened up my mind and the way. And I just went ahead and began to swim in that particular direction.
My parents are Gullah Geechee people from South Carolina, okay? And they were like maybe one generation away from sharecropping, cotton, and other things. And so my father was one who said, no. You got to learn, whether you like it or not. You've got to learn. You got to read a book. You can't read the front of the book and the back of the book and say that is what the book is all about. So it was really my father who pushed serious education. And because he had about a 3rd or 4th grade education, he really pushed. And also, I must say that it was my church that came in with its, exposure and to things that we didn't necessarily know about growing up in the Jets, going to Birdland, and not Birdland, but down to see various jazz musicians down the village, and going to various plays, because during the 60s there were plays about liberation constantly. So my church was very involved because they would take us out of the hood and take us to different parts of New York City so that we could see things that were going on. And so, yeah, it was my church and my parents.
What I've done within my family, my wife and I happen to be blessed with a very beautiful, beautiful wife of 54 years.
Yes.
When we got married, I said to her, we're going to have a revolutionary marriage. She said, what is that? This is back in the 60s. I said, we're not going to get divorced because I'm not going to have my children in a home without their mother and father to experience what I went through. I could not do anything about my mother and father. That situation was there when I came into the world. But I could do something about the children that I bring into the world, and I can make a difference in their life. So we had a unity in the house that our children were most important, and that we would teach them skills that we both have learned through the years. For example, you work and then you play. You don't go outside because everybody else is outside playing and they didn't do their homework. That's in their family. But in this family, you do your work first, then you go out and play. And you don't do it fast. You do it thorough. It's going to be checked. And if it looks like you just skip through it, you're going to not be able to go out and play. That kind of regiment in the house taught my children to be disciplined. It taught them the importance of high standards. It taught them the importance of prioritizing your time. It taught them the importance of time management, etc. Also, I told my children, or we told our children, that we will fight like hell for you when you're right. But just don't get us out there fighting when you're wrong, because then you weaken us in our efforts to protect you. So you have to tell us the truth, regardless of what that truth might be. I'd rather know the truth if you did something wrong than to go out to the school system and fight when I'm really, fighting and you didn't do anything that you're supposed to do. Also, the school. I went to the PTA meetings. I told my wife, let me go to the PTA meetings. And I used to sit in the PTA meeting and I tell my children, I don't want your teachers to tell me how nice you are. I want them to tell me what you're learning, what you're gaining, what your strengths, what your weaknesses. And so I would go to those PTA meetings or those parent-teachers conferences and hold the teachers accountable. And they would say, "Oh, your older son he seems like a daydreamer." I said, "Oh, really? So what's your strategy to help him not daydream?" My strategy? Yeah, your strategy. Because you're the teacher, right? So my job is to support you with a strategy that makes sense, okay? So I see that even in my grandchildren, my kids are doing the same thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's the little things that you do in your home that I wasn't taught when I was growing up. Had I been taught that, I'd probably be president of the United States,
I'd be your assistant, right.
something like that.
Sister Barbara, tell us about how you transferred this into your child raising strategies as a parent and a grandparent.
Well, it's so interesting because with my children, I have 3 children, all 3 from HBCUs, and that was the way to go with us. They went to Howard and Morehouse, and we weren't listening to any other thing. That was the key. We have raised our children in a way of respecting people, respecting themselves, and having books around the house and magazines, and having them to talk to other people that we felt that would strengthen them and not bring them down. And the other piece is my children hate to hear me say this because I grew up with 4 brothers, and I knew the dangers that were happening to black men, particularly at the age of 12, 14 years old. I was thinking of that brother who wrote that book, Man, Child in the Promised Land, 60s kind of thing. And, you hear how the system is set up to destroy our black boys. My children, and they hate for me to say this, they would come home and say, "Mom, I'm going to a party." And I said, "Really? Okay, that's wonderful. Where's the party?" "Well, it's down the street, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Oh, okay. So we're going to be right down there." I said, "Okay." So tell my husband, "Okay, we let them go. But guess what? Who's following them?" "You got it. Me." Okay, because I remember the parties in the 60s, okay? And so I would just follow them. They didn't know. They would think they were going someplace with the blue lights and party hardy and everything else, and that was fine. But you know what? I was behind the cars because I wasn't going to let the system where you're not going to get my boys nor were they going to get my neighbor's boys. And so that's what I did, because I saw what happened when we give our children up to the system. Our children come here tabula rasa, blank slate, okay, and we put in all the positiveness that we want in them. So yeah, that was one of the things. I'd go to the schools and I'd make sure that the teachers were my friends, okay? And I would set up, I want my son in that class, I want my daughter in this class, and so on and so forth. Okay, I have 2 businessmen and a doctor as a result of that. We don't play. Our children are precious. We're not gonna let our children go, nor are we gonna let your children go. I've had people that say, I want my kids in Mrs. Glover's class, because they knew what I was doing. And I'd go by and visit the children's home. They said, like, you're not coming to our house because I'm in the projects. I said, oh, really? I don't know nothing about the projects, right? Get in my car and go right to their house. Oh, my God, Miss Glover's outside. I said, yeah, right. We're not playing. We're not going to let you go. So that's how and I want people to understand that our children are valuable. All right? They're gifts to us. And we can use or abuse them, but we have to. They don't have to know we're following them. They don't have to know that they're in Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so's class. That's how. And they turn around, as my son said to me, thank you, Mommy. Big old 52-something-year-old man. My daughter said, thank you, Mommy. He said, right. That's what we have to do. And I learned that my parents did not do that. And that's what I am doing.
As I said earlier, I mean, the first thing is that all of my children came into the world, coming into a house in which there were books all over the place, where there's artwork, where we as African people are clearly reflected. So they had an understanding very early in regards to what was happening. The other thing, of course, is all of my children, came out of the situation that I was engaged in organizationally, educationally. The majority of my children went to independent black schools. They went to Uhuru Sasa Shule, which was at one point the largest independent black school in the country, which was part of the East organization, which I was part of. Then one child went to Weusi Shule, which was a school which came out of the East and Uhuru Sasa, which was really, kind of like a direct descendant of that. And that's been the experience. The other thing I remember very clearly is from the time that my children were infants, I always tell them, said, you're going to college. You're going to college. I told the females also, I said, listen, the only babies that are coming in here are going to be babies that are my babies, not your babies, until after you go ahead and get to college and do what it is that you have to do. And, we've been fortunate in regards to, that being the model. This year, I had a grandchild who graduated from Howard University and a child who graduated from high school this year, and she'll be going to New York University in September. So we've been doing okay. So far, so good.
What strategies, what recommendations do you think for that parent sitting in the audience or on the other side of the tube who's saying, oh my gosh, my Johnny, my Sally, is driving me crazy, and I want to make sure that my child does not wind up in a prison cell. I want to make sure that my child is doing something and doing good in the world. Let's talk about some strategies you can think of, starting with my brother Professor Blake.
Failing does not mean you're a failure. You have to really help children to understand that, because there's always going to be some difficult things that you're going to have to overcome as a child, whether it's academic or social issues, social pressures, etc. And you might not make it up to where you think you should be. And if you don't, that doesn't mean you're a failure, just because you failed in trying to achieve something. The only time you are a failure, as I tell my children, is when you get knocked down and you stay down. You get knocked down, somebody else can knock you down. But if you stay down, that's on you. Once you get up again, then you're successful, because that means you're going to try to achieve the things that you need to achieve. So don't get your kids so wound up because don't get wild. Like my oldest son, for example, he used to come home with red marks on all of his papers in junior high school. And my wife would just lay her head down and cry. She said, what are we going to do with this boy? I said, he's going to be okay. We just have to just keep at him. We punish him. That didn't work. We took his allowance. That didn't work. And he would say to me, he says, junior high school doesn't count, Dad. You know? I said, what do you mean it doesn't count? You know? He had figured it out in his mind that it didn't count. He's a PhD now, okay? You know, he didn't do it 4 years and then master's, you know. It took him time to get to that PhD level, but he got there. So failing doesn't mean you are a failure, and help reinforce the positive things in children. Get rid of that stinking thinking, that negative thinking. Oh, my child can't do this. Oh, my child is this. Stop. The world is already saying that about your child. You can't say the same thing that the world is saying about that black child in your house and expect that child to succeed. You have to let him know that you can do it. Any little progress, praise it. It's called positive reinforcement. Just over and over. You did, you know, I write well because my 5th grade teacher told me that I could write. It's the only person who ever told me I can do anything. You know, so I used to try to please them. When you love a child, they will jump through hoops for you.
That's true.
And you just communicate that love, let them know, okay, you're not doing everything that you need to do or want to do, but you can do it. Some people, it takes a little longer. The race is not won by the swift and strong. It's won by those who endure to the end.
This is so fulling. I mean, you're just saying all that. I would say also, the key also is to, you know, birds of a feather flock together, all right? And I always say to young people, you know, as you're moving up and you're moving forward, you know, you try to put your kids, encourage them to be with people that are moving forward, okay? Families that are moving forward, okay? Not a mother that's on a space someplace and a father that, you know, you really have to pick and choose. We're at war. We are seriously at war. And our children are the ones that are being knocked aside because they can't get to us because some of us are a little bit clear thinking, but it's our children. So, you know, I always say birds of a feather flock together. In my teaching and even in my home, you see the kids that are studying, the study people stay together, okay?
Well, first, you have to know what your children are doing. We live in a different kind of world. When we came up, there was one television, there was one radio, there was one record player or whatever it was that you were doing. There was one, which meant that it had to be controlled very often by the parents.
That's right.
Now we've created a situation in which how many TVs do people have in their homes? Children go around with devices that go ahead and they stream music and stream video or whatever. And half the time the parents don't know what it is that the children are actually going ahead and absorbing. Our children very often are being raised by their peer group, not by their parents. So in order for you as a parent to raise your child, you have to know what your child is doing, what they're involved in. That's a critical thing. Because too often in regards to this world where now everything is separate and apart, as I said, from that collective experience to these individual experiences, we have to go ahead and try to see how we can control that. One of the things to do is that at some point, everybody's looking at the television and looking at the same thing. Everybody's listening to the same music. Everybody's going to the movies together to see the same thing. Because then in regards to that particular collective experience, you know exactly what your child has absorbed and have really participated in a collective educational situation, which is really going to be positive no matter, you know, what it is that you actually went ahead and did all together.
At this time, first of all, we want to give our guests a well-deserved round of applause. And I want to also give you an opportunity. Are there any questions out there? If anyone has a quick, and it has to be brief, you make the question, say the question, and then we'll ask one of the guests to respond. Does there anyone have any questions?
My name is Pt.2. I just want to thank you guys for coming out. It was very informative. I just have a question. And I know you guys were speaking. Sister, you said you you teach the history of black education, right? African American education. I wonder, do you believe, was integration a good or bad thing for African American education?
Integration, really, I went to a black college. We had the best teachers in that college under segregation because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. They had to teach at the college because they had to teach to make a living. So we had scholars in every field that were black. When integration came, those white schools got those scholars out of there, hired them in the white school, and sent inferior teachers in these black colleges. So no, integration is definitely, the black community, for example, when I was in Durham, North Carolina, they had black businesses all over the place. You can just walk a few blocks from the campus. You got a restaurant, you got a barbershop, you got a grocery store, black owned. When integration came, all of that was taken out. So it hurt us economically.
Absolutely.
It hurt us educationally, and it hurt us socially, because another thing, those black teachers taught in those colleges that you were getting your education to serve your people, that it was not important for you just to advance yourself intellectually for your own self-aggrandizement. You were struggling to get education so you can advance our people. That kind of community thought left with integration.
And the last thing to think about is that in every major city in this country, the schools are more segregated today than they were in 1954, if you can imagine that. Okay, I talk about, my mother was born in 1925, and when she went to school, the schools were more integrated than they are now. So how do we explain that? If you remember, Brown versus Board of Education said that there would be integration with all deliberate speed. What is that? And what has happened? We see what all deliberate speed has actually meant. It's not happening. It's not taking place.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for your presentations, all members of the panel. My name is Carmen, and I have a question about black independent schools. What would all of you see as the future of the black independent schools? And then also, what would you say is the impact the independent schools have had on our young people and the community?
Basir, you need to answer that.
I'll start, yeah. Having been involved in that particular struggle from early on, I've been a teacher at a black independent school. As I said, most of my children went to black independent schools. I was the headmaster of Shule Mapinduzi. These schools are critical to our success as a people. The question is when we reached a particular time in terms of political and economic turmoil, that many of those schools essentially fell by the wayside. There are still black independent schools around the country that exist, but what we have to do is that we have to see how economically we can go ahead and support them. The issue is we have to see the existence of these schools as important as we see some of the other things that people go ahead and spend money on all the time. People will go out and spend $100 on a pair of sneakers, but if you say, buy a book for $20, they say, oh man, that book is too expensive. All right? So our priorities are wrong. And we have to go ahead and understand that whether it's going to be an independent after-school program, an independent weekend, or an independent school that's going to actually run Monday through Friday school time, we have to create more of these particular educational institutions. I think it's critical to our existence.
I just want to say also, it really is the curriculum. You got to really look at the curriculum. Are we looking at a curriculum that's going to encourage our kids for the 21st century and beyond? The curriculum that's in place now, it's too inferior for our children. So we're talking about independent school, but we're also talking about zeroing on that curriculum. What is that curriculum really teaching our children? Is it preparing our children, skill-wise, critical thinking, and so much more? So I would say, independent school, public school, let us focus on that curriculum, what that curriculum offers.
On behalf of Cultural Caravan, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We are basically available via YouTube, on our YouTube channel, as well as online, and we encourage you to tune in, to tell a friend, and to really support these broadcasts, because the only way we can do this is with your continued support, and that means financial support as well. At this time, first of all, we want to give our guests a well-deserved round of applause.
Oh my darling, oh my darling, let it go. You know I really love you. You are one. Why do I feel this way? Why do